everyone. Welcome to the Brown Critic channel. I'm Gayatri. So it's with immense pleasure we present to you one of India's foremost poets, K Satchidanandan, who will read from his most recent book, Questions from the Dead, published by Copper Coin, New Delhi. So before I hand this over to Sachida, I would like to read a few lines which German critic Wolfgang Kubin wrote. He says, K Satchidanand is definitely not a poet who keeps aloof from the world. He's a poet on a journey. Poetry for him is a cry against all walls. It's his cosmopolitanism that makes Satchidanand interesting beyond India. So welcome to our channel, Sachida. It's such an honor for us to have you on our channel and talk about the conceptualization of your book, Questions from the Dead, and read some wonderful poems from it. Appreciate this very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Gayatri, for having me here. And thank you for the opportunity to discuss my new collection of poems in English translation, Questions from the Dead, published by Copper Coin, Delhi. About conceptualizing Questions from the Dead, I would first of all like to say that I had begun translating my poetry into English right from the late 1970s for various reasons. First, I had a lot of friends in India and abroad who I had met at various literary gatherings and festivals of poetry who did not know Malayalam and were curious to read more of my poetry. In the early days, I used to read translations done by other people, mostly poets, including some senior poets like Dr. Ayyappa Panikkar, who was one of the pioneers of Malayalam poetry. But I was not very happy, in fact, with their versions in English. So I began to try my hand at translating some of my poems. And in fact, they were accepted by journals abroad, and of course, many journals in India, and also by some of the anthologies published here and abroad. That gave me quite a lot of confidence as a translator of my own poetry. Since then, I have been translating those poems that I found translatable and maybe worthy of being translated into English. And I should confess that I did not dare translate some of my poems, which are very popular in Kerala, because I felt they would stay only in Malayalam, because they were too local, full of regional references, and it was very hard to convey their music in any language other than Malayalam, because quite a few of them were written in meters, either traditional or constructed and created by me. And the music formed a part of the structure and the total experience of those poems. So I wouldn't dare attempt to translate them. And even now, most of those poems, which are so dear to the Malayalis, remain untranslated in any language other than Malayalam. Only quite a few have gone into some of the languages in India, especially Tamil, Telugu and Kannada, which are rather close to Malayalam. But even though I began translating my poems in the 1970s, my first collection in English, which was titled Summer Rain, was published only in 1995, though already, as I said, many translations had appeared in anthologies and journals. And Summer Rain was received rather well, and so it was followed by several collections and selections like How to Go to the Tao Temple, Imperfect and Other Poems, So Many Birds, and Stammer. And then these individual collections were followed by many selections from my poetry. The first of them being While I Write, brought out by HarperCollins India, and then Misplaced Objects and Other Poems, published by Sahitya Akademi when I won the Sahitya Akademi Award, and then various other collections, thematic collections like The Whispering Tree, a collection of love poems, and No Borders for Me, a collection of my travel poems, both published by Hawa Kal, based in Kolkata and now also based partly in Delhi. And then another collection called I Am a Language, which is a collection of my poems on language and on poetry. This was published by Thowley Books in Bhubaneswar. And then came the bigger collection, perhaps my biggest collection so far, of about 600 pages, called The Missing Rib, a collection of poems right from the 60s to around 2015, which was published by Poetry Wala. It was called The Missing Rib. And they also brought out a second collection of poems which were not included in their collection but were written after their collection from 2015 onwards. That was called Not Only the Oceans. And The Questions from the Dead, the book that is under discussion now, in fact carries my poems from 2018 to 2021. It was not actually planned as a collection. In fact, I never planned poems as a kind of collection. But when I had enough poems for a collection, Sarabjit Garcha of Copper Coin approached me and I said, well, I have now enough poems for a collection. And then both of us together put those poems in some kind of an order. In fact, it carries 40 poems from this period of around 3 years. And some of these poems are not single poems, but they are sequences, each poem carrying many poems with subtitles, even though they are connected by a single theme. In fact, as I grow older, I tend to forget my recent past while I remember my childhood, my parents, and my early life in the village in vivid detail. I think it happens to all of us as we grow old. As you know, this has been a period also of continuing political turmoil and growing authoritarianism in the country, not only in the country perhaps, also in many countries, forcing us to rethink the idea of the nation and the idea of democracy and even the idea of human civilization, including the idea of the continuous progress of human civilization, about which I have very serious doubts now. I have many poems on Gandhi, some of them are here too, but Gandhi has been coming back to me with a new force and relevance in recent times, even though I wrote my poem Gandhi and Poetry long ago, which was followed by another poem called Gandhi and the Tree. But more recently, Gandhi has been returning to my poetry time and again. And as I said, there are one or two poems referring to Gandhi in this collection too. And even after that, I have written a poem called The Cobbler of Sabarmati, about Gandhi making his own shoes. Kerala, meanwhile, had a huge flood in 2018, contemplating which gave me two whole sequences of poems. And there are also many poems that are introspective, looking at myself, and also retrospective, looking at my own past, my mother, my father, my childhood. And some poems connect directly or indirectly with the unique experience of the pandemic through which we are even now passing. Poems like The Train, about the condition of the migrants that I happened to see in Delhi, and poems like On the Earth, History, From Where, Distances. All these are in some way directly or obliquely linked to the various dimensions of this experience, like the solitude, at the same time the nature that we find outside, which seems completely unaffected by what is happening to human beings, and also a new kind of life that we are compelled to lead in these days, including the virtual life in which we are participating exactly at this moment. And there are also some poems which continue my reflections in my earlier poems on gender, on caste, on love and hatred, and on violence. What actually links these apparently diverse poems together is perhaps my vision of a juster and a more egalitarian world, free from hate and the various forms of injustice that we find all around. I look at my social and personal experience in many of these poems, and I think taken together, the poems reflect a tension between a perceived utopia and an experienced dystopia. And it is this tension that I believe keep these poems somewhat alive and vibrant. And perhaps some of the readings I will do from the collection will, I hope, prove my point.
Thank you very much for that, Sachida. So, nearly 25 years ago, in 2016 to be precise, I published your poem in the Brown Critique, which I used to then edit and published. I'll read a few lines from the poem which was published. It's called Encounter. It was republished in a special issue in 2000 called Nostalgia. So, Encounter by K Satchidanandan. To meet my God, I rode on the buzzing of a bee and went along the road of the word. A roaring black tiger kept me company. That road led me to death in the battlefield. To meet my God, I got into the vein of a dry leaf and went along the road of silence. A dumb camel kept me company. That road led me to death in the mountain snow. So as far as the poems in Questions from the Dead are concerned, I would say my favorite would have to be 70 to 75, Three Kittens, and of course The Enchantress. Apart from the striking imagery in all three of them, I found the poems to be honest, brutally so, telling it as it is, poignant and playful at the same time as in the Three Kittens. Please tell us how these poems came about, and you could also read them for us.
Thank you, Gayatri, for asking me to read these poems. I shall read the first one. Between 70 and 75. It was written a little before I became 75. There is a dark place between 70 and 75, broad like memory, deep like death. Those trapped there have no return. They roam about in the childhood bushes or fall headlong into the well of decrepitude. Be warned, if those between 70 and 75 behave like the young, for they are young. They can love, can dance to music, and if need be, even lead a war or a revolution. In fact, they are not dead, like most young are. Those between 70 and 75 may suffer from delusions. At times they want a horse ride, at times want to fly above oceans and mountains on the back of an eagle, wander along deserts looking for water that is not there, stand naked in the rain, or read a poem no one has written yet. There are times when they feel history is retracing its step and feel like crying aloud, screaming almost. The solitude of those between 70 and 75 is sepia, like some early morning dreams, or like the friendships in old albums. When they laugh, sunlight retreats into village lanes. Their sweat smells soft like sesame flowers. Their walk is like the descending scale of Saveri, and their lilting speech is littered with gamakas. You wonder why this is all about men. Yes, women do not pass at all between 70 and 75. Invisible to us, they just glide along on a tender rainbow of affection with the soft feet of fairies, fragrant like heaven, and the smile of oleanders, an invitation to salvation. I shall now read the second poem that you wanted, Three Kittens. Three kittens. Three kittens, one white, one grey, one golden. Three garden pots, one plant has a red flower, one blue, one violet. The white kitten upturns the garden pot with the red flower. The grey kitten upturns the garden pot with the blue flower. The golden kitten upturns the garden pot with the violet flower. Then the kitten and the flowers exchange their colors among them. Three kittens, one red, one blue, one violet. Three garden pots, one has white flower, one grey, one golden. And I, with no color, the one who sees everything fade In fact, this poem was written when we actually had three kittens uh, uh, of these three colors, white, grey, and golden. And it is true, they most often hid themselves among our garden pots in the balcony. And the poem somehow also in my memory connects with a story I had read in my young days. You know, we all grew up on Soviet children's tales, and one of them had these kittens passing through pipes and coming out with different colors. So maybe that memory too aided in the making of this particular poem. And now to come to your third poem, The Enchantress. This is a poem on my mother, of course, partly imagined, but in fact, my mother used to talk to cats and dogs and the trees in our compound, and I often felt there was something magical about her. Also, this is about her, and it is partly real. The Enchantress. My mother was an enchantress. My daughter has seen her dance with cats at night. House geckos used to respond to her call. With her index finger, she maneuvered the movements of spiders. At home, leg by leg. A single frown from her, and the cockroaches fell flat, their thin legs groping the air. When they heard her footsteps, rats returned to the laps of the witches who had sent them. She returned the owl's hoot and the fox's howl. Even sterile cows began lactating as she stroked their backs. Coconut trees bent down to drop their tender fruits into her thin hands. Mango trees burst into blossoms at her touch. Even the plates and ladles at home stood to attention at her command. Ghosts smiled at her like neighbors. She knew by heart the lexicon of ants and grasses. Using different synonyms, she changed the rain's rhythms and the wind's beats. She gazed the clouds. She grazed the clouds, lightning for her whip. Butterflies formed a halo around Mother's head. She recognized each crow by what it had been in its previous birth. She found the names of squirrels, reading their lines, summoned them, and taught them Malayalam. Reading the map of her battle spit, she prophesied father's death on the temple hill. When his clothes came back, she hugged them as if father was still inside them. She prepared meals for guests even before the crows announced their arrival, planted coconut saplings, and sowed vegetable seeds for each of her unborn grandchildren. The only thing mother could not predict was the end of her own world. Sitting in that darkness, I recall that world. The barn in the fields and the paddy measure, the winnowing flat and the bamboo mat, songs of the ploughman and the weeding women, the thorny names of the paddy seeds, and my bleeding black black roots.
Thank you so much for reading those poems. They were really enjoyable. Can you also please elaborate on the themes and structures of some of the poems in the book? Poems such as After the Deluge, which has many sections, Letter from the Soldier from a Soldier, and the ones on Jesus, the Prophet, and Siddharth come to mind.
It's quite true that all poems have a context. It could be purely psychological, it could be natural, it could well be social. And it is true about my poems too. If you look at the longest poem in this collection, After the Deluge, it was written as a kind of response to the deluge in Kerala in 2018. At that point of time, I was in Kerala. I had gone there for a meeting, and I was supposed to return after 3 days. But by the time the water had risen so much that even the Kochi airport had to be closed. So I had to wait for almost a week to return to Delhi, where I regularly live. I followed the news of the deluge with intense concern. I felt I needed to respond to it, as the experience was shocking me, and the sights of people suddenly losing their homes, being trapped in islands, as well as having unique solidarity and saving strangers, risking their own lives, were agonizing and inspiring at the same time. On the other hand, I was also conscious of the continuous assault on the environment by the spokesman of development that was chiefly responsible for the catastrophe. I knew I had to invent a new way to speak about all these and to articulate these very different, diverse perspectives. So I made the rain, the river, the mountain, the forest, the bird, the house, the dog, the fishermen, the people who helped, the retreating water, and finally the sun speak and have their own takes on the tragedy. The form, a series of monologues, was a natural outcome of this inner demand, which was aesthetic and psychological at the same time. Pictures drawn on water, another somewhat long poem, another sequence poem in this collection, is a kind of afterthought. It is more of a meditative sequence I could conceive only after the flood had receded. Ruminations, which is again a kind of series of poems, is also contemplative in nature, where I think about the deeper meaning of objects and their links to the vicissitudes of existence, to life and to death. Letter from a Soldier was written after I watched an exhibition of letters from the soldiers from Punjab in the First World War that formed a part of an installation, the Memorial for Lost Words, that was the title of the installation, by Bani Abidi at the Khoj Art Gallery in Delhi. Of course, they were very different, those letters, but they were painfully inspiring, and my familiarity with the Punjabi life and culture as a resident of Delhi with a lot of refugee colonies, in one of which I lived for some time, certainly helped, as well as my travels in the Punjab. It was a French journalist who interviewed me in Paris who first brought to my notice a feature common to many of my poems: the tendency to be narratives, even stories. He asked him how he got the idea, as many of my actual narrative poems have never been translated. I have quite a few in Malayalam. Then he pointed to poems like Gandhi and Poetry, one of the many poems in my French collection. Then I discovered quite a few of my poems had characters and conversations. In fact, until that interview, I was not conscious of this. Three of the poems in this collection, The Prophet and the Ant, Jesus and the Donkey, and Siddhartha and the Squirrel, follow this pattern. It has characters, it has mostly conversations. I have also recently written a poem after the poems in this collection around Gandhi. I have quite a few poems on Gandhi, and this one is titled The Cobbler of Sabarmati, where the leather Gandhi chooses to make his sandals speaks to him about his previous life. There is also an earlier poem called Gandhi and the Tree, where a tree speaks to Gandhi and even walks with him to provide him shade and prophesies his death. I have always believed that there is an ongoing conversation between people and objects, as well as people and animals. I have seen my mother speaking to cows and trees, and they respond in their language. In these poems, I have chosen an ant, a donkey, and a squirrel to engage Prophet Muhammad, Jesus Christ, and the Buddha in conversation. And the great prophets teach them, and even more, learn from these people they are talking to. I call them people, the ant, the donkey, and the squirrel. And they teach the prophets humility, the lesson of unity, of compassion, and of camaraderie. I have always believed that we have to learn a lot from trees and bees and from nature as a whole. And these poems are in fact products of this kind of an attitude to nature as an eternal teacher. I shall now read a shorter poem called The Keys. In fact, my father had died while he had gone on a pilgrimage, and only he had left the keys of his stable when he left, as if he had anticipated something, because generally he used to carry these keys wherever he went, and even when he went on pilgrimages. Because that table carried all the major documents and other things valuable to him and to the family. But this time he did not carry the keys, and we were a bit surprised that he hadn't carried them. And I connect this with several things, as you can see in the poem. The keys. When Gandhi was shot dead, I was just 2. Father must have wept. I don't remember. When Nehru died, I was 18. Father came home with the newspaper, and I saw him sit down, almost fall, his hands on his brow, leaning forward, pale. When father went on his pilgrimage, he had left his bunch of keys at home. He never returned. Only the news came on the 3rd day. Even today, I keep on trying those keys to open the secrets of the universe. My poems. So here, as you can see, I try to connect the keys with the demise of Nehru and of Gandhi, and also the key becomes a kind of symbol to the very act of writing poetry, which is one way of trying to explore the world and its mysteries. I'll read a poem, another poem, which also I happened to write during the pandemic when I watched with great anguish migrant workers waiting for trains, and quite a few of them walking home, walking 100 or 200 kilometers home, and even dying on the way as they were not able to catch a train. The train. That train is going to my village, but I am not on it. Its rails are inside me. Its wheels are on my chest, and its whistle is my scream. I won't be there when it comes back to take me, but my breath will travel seated on its roof, guarding my corpse. As the train stops at my village, my breath will re-enter my body and ride my waiting bicycle along the old familiar lanes. My children will come running as they hear its bell. Abu is here, Abu is here. In which language can I tell them it is my dead body that has arrived? Of heaven or of hell? I am somewhere in between. Let the well talk or the pond. If water refuses to speak, let my breath enter a crow on the drumstick tree in the courtyard and tell them the truth.
Well, really love the various, associations where you make in the keys, the poem you read, the keys left behind by your father who went on his last pilgrimage, especially the one which says, keys become a symbol of writing poetry. We know you're very vocal about the world that we inhabit. And do you really believe, Sachida, that poetry is still relevant and, of course, Can you tell us what is really the role of poets today?
Theodore Adorno, the well-known Frankfurt thinker, once said, "Poetry is impossible after Auschwitz." I don't think he had meant it literally to mean that the age of poetry has ended, but he was probably prophesying the birth of a new kind of poetry, a poetry of witness, created out of the remnants of language, a poetry without the halo of which Baudelaire once spoke in this famous poem published posthumously called The Loss of a Halo. Poetry that carries the eternal stamp of humanity outside and inside every object, as Neruda once said when he was trying to define what he called impure poetry, but which I believe is the nature of all poetry. A poetry for survivors, made out of words, salvaged from the shipwreck. Perhaps Adorno was speaking about this kind of a poetry about which Rosewicz, the great Polish poet, has also spoken in the introduction to his great anthology, Post-War Polish Poetry. I recently edited with another poet for Penguin an anthology of poetry titled Singing in the Dark. It is a collection of poetry written under the lockdown. While I gave this title, I wanted to remind the readers of the great German poet dramatist Bertolt Brecht's lines. Will there be singing in bad times? Yes, singing about bad times. I also recall Czesław Miłosz's famous lines. In a room where people unanimously maintain a conspiracy of silence, one word of truth sounds like a pistol shot. And also his lines, you who have wronged a simple man, bursting into laughter at his suffering, do not feel safe. The poet remembers. I very much subscribe, as I already said, to Neruda's concept of impure poetry, which he calls a poetry of loam where the water can sing, a poetry of bread where everyone may eat. So whenever somebody asks, as you did just now, about the social mission of poetry, especially in a time like ours, I recall all these poets, the many things they said, the many lines they wrote. All of us know that we are passing perhaps through the worst time that India has seen after partition. Of course, I'm not forgetting the dark days of the emergency, but we always knew the emergency would have an end. It couldn't continue endlessly. But now we are trapped in a kind of emergency about whose end we are not yet sure, even though we do continue to hope that one day the dawn will rise. So, because authoritarianism that verges on fascism, reckless violence, oppression and othering of the marginalized and the minorities a political culture of communal hatred, various forms of censorship, an attempt to destroy India's diversity, which is the source of its great cultural abundance and vitality, environmental degradation, and Goebbelsian propaganda, combined with the suppression of the freedom of expression. These are the features of a time when writers need to speak truth to power. I have spoken a lot about this already in my various interviews and in the various speeches I have given since 2014, and in the many articles I have written, and also, as perhaps you know, some of us have formed an organization called the Indian Writers Forum, and we run a quarterly called Guftagu and a website called Indian Cultural Forum, both of which are platforms of resistance. So, in several of my poems, I have tried to respond at times directly and at times obliquely to the plight of the country and of the people. And this collection, Questions from the Dead, is not an exception. I may just read maybe one or two samples of poems which reflect our situation and the country's situation at present. Let me read one poem, The Nation of Birds, with which in fact the collection ends. The Nation of Birds. Of course, it's the critique of nationalism as an ideology. As you very well know, this critique was begun long ago, and it was initiated by none other than Rabindranath Tagore, who was a committed internationalist and who was very much against the idea of nationalism as an ideology, which has nothing to do with patriotism. Because patriotism comes from the love of the country, the love of the people, your dedication to elevate the country to greater heights, civilizational heights, and also heights in every sense of the term. But nationalism produces egoism and also hatred of other nations, and even the othering of minorities and other sections of people within the country, because nationalists always try to construct a monolithic nation of their own dreams. And so this poem, in fact, is a poem against nationalism as an ideology. The Nation of Birds. The nation of birds has no borders, nor a constitution. All those who fly are its citizens, including poets. Its flag is the wing. Have you ever heard a cuckoo quarrel with a nightingale over its song? Or a crane driving a crow away for its color? If the owl hoots, it is not because it is jealous of the parrot. Has an ostrich or a penguin ever complained they can't fly? They begin chatting with the sky as soon as they are born. Clouds and rainbows descend to stroke them. At times, they lend their hues to the birds, like the cloud to the doves or the rainbow to the peacock. They dream seated between the sun and the moon. Then the sky fills with angels and stars. They can see even in the dark, chat with elves and fairies. They come down to earth. They come down to earth to comfort the grass or to open the flowers with their song. The fruits and worms they eat burst out of their eggs with tiny wings. One day I tried living as a bird. I lost my nationality. Nation is a cage. It feeds you first for your song, and when it begins to dislike your song, for your meat. I shall read finally the questions from the dead, which happens to be the title poem. The title was chosen by my publisher. The questions from the dead. It also bears a subtitle, an essay on nationalism. Which country's border was Huan Sang crossing when on a donkey he crossed the Himalayan pass with a sack full of Buddhist texts? Whence came the races that spoke Dravidian and Aryan tongues? Was there no one in India when they landed here? Not even a tribal? Where did the Bharatvarsha of Mahabharat and Meghadoot begin? Where did it end? Did Bhasa and Kapilar, the Tamil poet, belong to the same country? Where were the borders of the India of Fahian and of Al-Biruni? Where was Taxila? Which was the India Alexander set out to conquer? Which country did Ashoka and Akbar rule? Who created India? The East India Company or Mountbatten? Or was it Gandhi? When did Hindu become the name of a religion? When did Earth come to be in the history of the universe? When did nations come to be in the history of Earth? How many nations make a human body? What is the kinship between human soul and nations' maps? Did all the births of Bodhisattva take place in India? How many oceans are there in each language? How many skies in winds? How many seasons for love? I had been guarding the borders till yesterday. All my life I had arguments about borders. My living flesh bled, caught in their barbed wire fencing. I went to court in their name, killed many times, died many times. They said I would become a martyr if I died for the cause, that it would secure heaven for me. My land, I do not loathe you, nor do I worship you. Had I been born elsewhere, I would have lived another life. I would have needed a passport to enter you. Today, at last, I am going to cross all the borders and become part of the earth. Do not cover me with flags. Today I know we are a creation of coincidences, like our body, like the solar system. We have no scope for pride, and war does not have even that scope. Bury me deep without an anthem. No one ceases to ask questions just because one is dead. No one ceases to ask questions just because one is dead. Thank you, Gayatri.
Thank you very much for all that. It's really illuminating. You inspire us with your vast wisdom and commentaries on the human condition. I really liked the nation of the birds, the concept behind it. So I think singing about bad times is an apt way to describe many of your intensely profound poems, many of them written, I believe, during the pandemic. And also, it's a good way to end our conversation when you say no one ceases to ask questions just because one is dead. Thank you so much again, and we really appreciate the time you took to bring us your boundless compassion and keen perceptivity. We wish you all the very best with your book, Questions from the Dead. I'd really like to hold it up again here. You can pick up a book of K Satchidanandan's Questions from the Dead from Amazon and elsewhere that it's available. We'll put the links in the description box and also at the end of the video. We hope to bring you many more such fascinating videos in the future, and stay well, take care of yourself. Lots of love from Pondicherry. Bye.